I'm Garry Kitchens, David Crane. We're the old guys in the game industry. The topic is the early days of the game industry, so we'll give you a little bit of background on how we got into it, how we got started. Dave and I have worked together since 1982 and continuously up to Audacity Games, and we will tell you about that. But I'll let Dave start because he started with Atari and Nolan Bushnell.
Yeah, I joined Atari in 1987 while Nolan Bushnell was still there.
1977.
77.
Yeah.
Nolan was still there, although he had sold the company to Warner Communications, and it was going downhill from there. But got to work briefly with Nolan, worked for about 2 years at Atari. Atari got to be such an unpleasant place to work for that a few of my buddies and I spun off and we founded Activision. Activision was in the news recently when Microsoft bought it for $64 billion. Is that right? Something like that, right?
How much of that money did you?
I got nothing of that. I left Activision in 1987, but I can say that I started a company that was worth $64 billion, so that's worth something.
It is. Okay. It is. Bragging rights.
Yeah. But, yeah, Atari had come out with their home game machine, the Atari 2600. And the purpose behind the Atari 2600 really was so that they could bring their arcade games into the home. Atari was well known for making arcade games. Pong was really the first successful arcade game, and they had a whole bunch of them. And so anyway, they wanted to be able to sell home games, and that's why they made the cartridge programmable Atari 2600. Now, when we started Activision, we didn't own any arcade games, so we had to create brand new game content, all original. You know, didn't look like anything else that had ever been done before. So games like Pitfall and all the games we did back then were original content that we had to create out of blue sky. We had the original four guys who had left Atari, plus we had a friend of mine who actually played professional foosball for a couple of years with this guy. But anyway, so we couldn't really compete with, or we couldn't expand with just the five of us. So we started looking around, and at the time, Garry was doing games for other people. And he approached Activision right at the same time we were looking, and it turns out to be a very coincidental situation, and he ended up joining Activision, but in an office in New Jersey while we were in California.
I was on the East Coast with my brothers, and I was in college for art because I was always an artist, illustrator. And I got a job working in a little tiny electronics company, and had no idea I had any skill in electronics, but kind of got dumped into this small company where there was way too much to do and everybody had to do 20 different things. Before I knew it, I learned electronics. I was doing things way beyond my skill level and salary. I came up with the idea to reverse engineer the Atari, because I had seen this guy on the West Coast. I mean, Activision was making headlines. They went from zero to $60 million in 1 year, and a video game industry was really starting to take off. And at that point in time, this little company I was in, we were doing electronic toys, and I worked on electronic toys like handheld game called Wildfire, another one called Bank Shot, where you did billiards, and these were little electronic toys with red LEDs. And they were great successes, but they were getting killed by video games, because video games on TV, much better image. So I reverse engineered the Atari, and then left the company. I wrote a game called Space Jockey for the company I was at. And then I went to them and said, look, I'm making $11,000 a year, and I just created a video game in a market where you'd never enter it without me reverse engineering. And I've made 2 hit games, and they said, well, you're not worth more than $11,000. So after some thought, a microsecond, I left, and I ended up getting a contract with Coleco because they needed somebody to program the Atari 2600 to do Donkey Kong. Now, at that point in time, 1980, I may have been the only person on the planet who knew how to program the 2600, except for the guys at Activision and the guys at Atari, because, I mean, there may have been somebody in Texas, Apollo Games, who was right around that same time. But anyway, I had reverse engineered it, so it was fortuitous. And I did Donkey Kong, and I was finishing up, and we really liked the Activision games. I mean, we loved them. And thought they were really doing the best work. So I picked up the phone and called the main number and asked for product development and got bounced around. Eventually got a guy, and I said, look, we write games for the Atari. We'd like to work with you guys. And he said, you don't write games for the Atari. Nobody does that except for Activision and Atari. I said, oh, all right. I said, look, I got to run. I'm finishing Donkey Kong for Coleco. And it was silence. He said, all right, I'll be there tomorrow. So he flew out, came, met with us. We flew to California, met Dave and his crew, and soon we opened the Eastern Design Center for Activision. That was 82. And we immediately started working with these guys. And that's when I met Dave, and we've worked together ever since. And we love the Atari. We love the Atari platform. We like writing 6502 assembly language, which is completely insane, but we love to do it. No one would, any programmer today in the game industry wouldn't touch it with a 10-foot pole, but we love it. And Dave and I really hit it off. Technically, we could talk the same language. Creatively, we both had art backgrounds, and we work really well together. And that's where I got into the game industry.
Yeah, it's not an exaggeration that there were maybe 50 people in the world who knew how to do what we were doing. So it was a very small fraternity.
And we didn't know, back at that point, we didn't know that what we were doing was anything special. I mean, we just, we didn't know we were founding an industry or paving the way for an industry which is now bigger than films and music combined. And I guess I figured out I was doing something special. One day I bought a house with my first wife, and it was no fancy, just a regular house, not a big fancy thing. And I'm moving this in the neighborhood, and I come outside, roll a garbage can out the end of the driveway, and there's a kid living a couple of doors down, like 12-year-old, and he comes over, he goes, you guys are new here? I said, yeah, we moved in 2 weeks ago. And he goes, I want to ask you something. Do you know that you have the same name as a world-famous video game designer? And I said, no, I didn't know that. I was like, what? So anyway, let's fast forward to present day. Dave and I obviously did a lot of games on the Atari that, Dave more than me, some of the biggest games ever on the Atari. I mean, amazing games like Pitfall and Decathlon and Pitfall 2. I did Keystone Capers, Donkey Kong, Pressure Cooker. And subsequently, today, and in the last 5 years, we'll get calls all the time from shows and say, would you guys come out and give a presentation, take questions from the audience, sign autographs if anybody brings games that they want signed in the old game. So we would always gladly do that. And it was fun for us. We love meeting the people and talking to them about the golden era of the early 80s. But then the homebrew wave happened, and people were making games on the Atari. So people started asking us at every show, hey, I got an idea. Why don't you make an Atari game? And as hard as those games are to do, me and Dave would look at each other and just go, oh, my God, are you kidding me? So then we go to another show. Hey, why don't you guys make Atari games? And we thought it was the nuttiest idea we'd ever heard. But in 2018, we came home from one of those shows, and we said, why not? So we started working on an Atari game, but we didn't tell anybody. Because we knew if we told somebody, it would get around, everybody would, then every show would be, when's the game coming out? When's the game coming out?
All of a sudden there would be a deadline.
And we didn't want deadlines.
We didn't want one of those.
We were not stepping into deadlines. So we worked for 3 years. in complete seclusion, not telling anyone what we were doing. No one knew. And then one day we announced in 2021, March, we said we're starting a new company called Audacity Games, because who but us would have the audacity to make games for a 40-year-old console? How stupid are we? And we're going to eventually announce games. And everybody said, that's unbelievable, but it'll probably be another 2 years. A week later, we announced that we were selling Circus Convoy. And we knew when we were doing these games. I mean, I explained, Dave, what the strategy was. It wasn't just about putting out a binary for the Atari 2600 that you could download and use with Stella or an emulator. It was really different. We were delivering an experience.
Well, I mean, homebrew is great. The homebrew movement was people who said, I've heard it's hard to make a game on the Atari 2600. I'd like to try, and I'm going to try, and I'm going to spend some time, and I'm going to put out a game, and maybe, burn it onto a couple EPROMs and sell it to family or friends or whatever. And we said, no, let's bring back the Activision experience from the 1980s. So that in those 3 years, we were not just making a game, but we were building a injection molded tool for new plastic. We were going to put brand new, with a brand new cartridge, color label, color box, color manual, all of the things that you used to crack open on Christmas morning in 1982 and 83, and do it in the quality that Activision did back in those days. And there's a lot of effort to creating a company, to creating the product, to creating the manuals, the boxes, doing all the art and all that kind of stuff. But it's a whole package. When you get an Audacity Games product, it should bring you back to those days when you got to see this brand new, beautiful, colorful Activision game that came out. Now, we're not associated or affiliated with Activision in any way, but we were part of that movement.
Well, and we recognize how special that time period was. Another thing we do that no one has done since, except for Activision, was promote the designer. Designer's picture in the manual. The game has the designer's name on the box. I mean, Activision really pioneered that. And then lo and behold, Activision stops doing it. Anybody else in the industry do it? Who designs Halo? Anybody know? I mean, real diehards may know one name associated with Halo, but there are 200 people working on it. You don't know any of them. So they lost that, and we wanted to bring that back too, and really make it feel like. And well, let me just say, the thing that really keeps us doing it is people coming to shows and saying, "Look, I'm sure you've heard this before, but thank you for doing this, because this is what I loved about my childhood, was buying these games and the beautiful manual, the beautiful box, the experience, sending out and getting patches for high scores. Yes, we have patches. We have high scores with patches. We recreated the entire experience, and we love to do it, and people really appreciate it. And I had somebody the other day say something on one of the social media, basically, you idiot. You know how many more games people would be playing if you were selling them as downloadable, digital $20 whatever? And I'm like, you don't get it. That's not the point. The point is, it's got to be the whole experience. And if you come over to our booth right by the door when you go back in, that's what you see, the whole experience. I mean, we're not ripping anybody off. We're not using code from old games. This is all new stuff, but it's from the people who brought you the best games of that era. And that's really what our goal is. And along with us, we have my brother Dan, who did Crackpots and Kung Fu Master and ported Ghostbusters onto the platform. And we have John Van Ryzen, who did Hero, which is an amazing 2600 game that never got the attention because it came out after the crash, or right at about the time of the 84 crash. But everybody you talk to who's a real aficionado says, oh, my favorite game is Hero, because everybody loves Hero. So we got John to do another game in the Hero genre, alien abduction, which we have. So that's kind of our story of how we did it 45 years ago and how we're doing it again.
Skipping a lot of stuff in the middle.
Yeah, there was a lot of stuff in the middle, but it's not as interesting. So,
well, what people, unless you're developers in this industry from way back when, realize is that a new console came out every 2 years. So we loved the Atari 2600, and it lasted longer than it was supposed to last for a number of reasons. But then came the,
NES.
well, the end, way before that, the Odyssey 2, the Intellivision, the Sega Genesis, the NES, the Super NES,
7800, 5200.
5200. And every time a new console came out, we had to go back in the lab and say, all right, first thing we got to do is we got to reverse engineer it so we can make games for it. We have to build development tools so that we can test games on it and rewrite sound drivers and image compressors and decompressors and all the things that we had to do to make a game in a ROM. We had to redo all that over and over and over again. And we did that on every console ever made. I published a game on 25 different consoles in my career. So that's the middle, We started in the 2600, we're back on the 2600, then there was all that stuff in the middle.
Right.
So one of the things that people like to do is they like to ask, what was the story behind the development of their favorite game or whatever. So we can talk a lot, but we'd rather just answer your questions if you'd like. Anybody have any questions?
Go ahead.
So for the game you designed under the Audacity label, what are some of your inspirations for those newer games?
Well, I mean, it's a different process because of ROM size. Why don't you explain that?
Yeah, I mean, certainly every game has had inspiration. I did a game called Freeway, which ended up as two chickens trying to cross 10 lanes of traffic. And I was in a bus on the way to CES on Lakeshore Drive when I saw an idiot try to run across 10 lanes of traffic to save $5 in parking because it was $5 cheaper on one side than on the other. And I turned to the guy next to me and I said, now there's a good idea for a video game, and Freeway was born. So there are these inspirations that just happen. Sometimes it's also just complete fevered dream. Garry and I did A Boy and His Blob. And A Boy and His Blob is a story about a boy who makes friends with an extraterrestrial shape-changing blob who will change into different shapes if you feed him different flavors of jelly bean. And so you carry jelly beans in your backpack and you turn him into ladders and bridges and you climb through, you do this adventure. That was just completely out of the blue. You start with this idea of the shape-changing blob, and so what am I going to do with him? And so many of the games just evolved from a kernel of an idea. Some of them do have an inspiration.
What was the name of that medicine you were taking at that point?
Yeah, I was not taking medication. People always thought I was when I told them the story. Just to take a complete aside, that kind of thing doesn't happen anymore because games cost $100 million to make. And if I had gone to a company and said, I need $100 million to make this game about this boy who has a shape-changing blob and he feeds him jelly beans, they would have laughed me out of the building. But back then, we just came up with our own ideas and funded them ourselves. So with Circus Convoy, you can see some pitfall in it because it's side view, screen to screen. There's mini games in it that are so often you just say, what can I make look good on an 8-bit machine? And that becomes a game. You figure out how do I then interact with it to play. So it's so iterative. The process just goes from idea to, this leads me to that idea, this leads me to that idea. I can't think of any particular inspiration on Circus Convoy, except it was a circus. So when I was creating...
we always liked the circus because it would give us good graphics.
Creating mini games, like there's Clobber the Clown is in there, which Garry had done this beautiful clown character. And so I said, well, let's turn it into the Whack-A-Mole. So it's a Whack-A-Mole game with these clown heads. A lot of it has to do with what you can do on the platform. Because think of 10 objects, 7 of them you probably can't do in 8 bits.
Like you do them and you look at them and you convince yourself. You go, that is a really good-looking goat. And then I call my wife over and go, what is this? Can you tell me? And she goes, I don't know, is that a spider? See, you throw that out. Because if you can't make it look like something that people can recognize, we don't put it in the game.
You don't want to have to say, hey, go get the goat.
Right.
You know?
No, you don't want to do that. So it's many times it's what you can make. Like Keystone Capers, one of the main reasons I made it was one day I was just goofing around and I made an escalator. I thought an escalator would be a cool thing to make. And I'm always obsessed with making animations of mechanical things. So I said, what's a mechanical thing that would be called escalator? And I made it, and the ladder goes up. And I spent an hour making sure that the guy who jumped on the escalator would always land on a step. Like, it would drive me crazy if he was between steps and then he went click, you know, and it wasn't real. I said, no, it's got to be real. So the guy jumps and he perfectly lands on this step. Every time it's clean, perfect. And once I had that, I said, now I got to make a game about a guy in a building with an escalator. What can I do? And that's, you know, how it happened. Yep.
I'm just curious, you guys pioneered so much in the early days of the most constrained platforms. Creatively, you've mentioned multiple times that those constraints help push you and guide you creatively in terms of what you do, solving those problems. What about today's developers, where it can be infinitely high res, infinitely high frame rate, and there are no limits to the size, any, you know, it can render anything.
Yeah, it makes it harder, I think.
Well, how do you don't have the constraints anymore? How do you solve it? Like, how do you still be creative without the constraints pushing you?
Well, we go back to the 2600.
We're like,
Unlimited platform?
Yeah.
like I have this beautiful dog who learned how to grow up in a crate. Now, I don't ever put that dog in a crate, but there's a crate in the room. And once in a while, you'll see the dog walk back and go in the crate because he likes the confined space. Makes him feel secure. And that's what the 2600 is to us. It's a crate.
There's an
We
excellent
go back in our crate.
an excellent book out there called Racing the Beam. It was intended to be the first in a multiple series of books talking about how the platform influences the game that are created on the platform. And so you have any interest in the technical background of the Atari 2600, it's all in there. But that's their point, is the platform does, in fact, constrain the type of game that's being made. I would have never tried to make Pac-Man on the Atari 2600, no matter how much money I thought I could make, because I didn't think it would work well with the platform's limitations. And as it turns out, it didn't. So, yeah, we would do that. Now, I was at a conference, speaking at a conference with the creator of God of War, and he pulled me aside and he said, you know, I can write these big story games, you know, till the cows come home. You create a story, you create a storyline, just like you're writing a novel, and
He's
you go
got
that
200
direction,
guys with him
you know.
doing it.
And then that leads to, we got to staff it up with this many artists and staff it up with this many programmers, and here's the goal, and we're going to meet every week, and we're going to see how we're going toward our goal, et cetera, et cetera. He said, what you guys used to do is you guys figured out how to make a single screen game that was fun to play. He said, I tried doing that. I tried it for 6 months, couldn't do it. It's a skill. We had it. We're lucky to have it, and we found a place where we could use it. But it's just a different world. When you have no constraints, you do have to, I mean, you know, look at an artist who writes a book, sits down with a blank sheet of paper. That is an unconstrained, you know, console. So it's just a different mindset, different way of working, I guess.
And by the way, when I say 200 guys, I'm using that in a general sense. There are certainly women and guys on the team. I don't mean to say it's entirely a male industry. Go ahead.
Curious, does any of your modern games use a driving controller? And if not, are you planning on using it?
I love the driving controller. I was at Atari when Atari created the driving controller. And Atari made the driving controller, and they packed it in with the Indy 500 cartridge. And when they did that, it meant that nobody else could ever write a game using the driving controller. because when they sold the console had joysticks and paddles, and so we could write joystick and paddle games, but they did not sell the driving controller separately from the Indy 500 game. So the only driving controllers out there were people who had bought Indy 500, and that takes your market from 100% of Atari owners to 15% of Atari owners, and they flat out refused to let us make any games with driving controllers.
That's why the Kinect failed. Remember the Kinect? I mean, I can't even imagine the billions that Microsoft spent building that sucker. And they tried every which way, but the fact of the matter was, people who did games were not going to support it unless they knew that everyone had it and was using it. And it never reached that. So these accessories that are a subset of the market, who in their right mind, who's judged by volume of how many games are sold, is going to say, well, I'm going to go for the subset of the market. I'm only going to, I want 15% of my people to buy the game, not 100%. You don't do it.
So that's probably a no
I think so.
to your question.
Okay. Come on, there were other hands.
Hey, you mentioned that you guys have made games for like 25 different systems at this point, a lot of which you had to work backwards to figure out how to program on, right?
Right.
I've heard stories in the past about certain consoles being famously difficult to work with. Any particular fun or terrible stories about trying to figure out how to work on one of these?
Wow. Yeah, there's lots of those stories. Of course, the 2600 was the hardest to work on. The interesting thing about the 2600, I do go down this little path a little bit, is the 2600 lasted 10 years in the market, and every other game console lasted about 2 years. And the reason was, when Atari was making this console, they had a design of what the TIA, the television interface adapter, the chip that talked to the screen, what it was going to be capable of, how many sprites it was going to be able to do, how they positioned, that sort of thing. And they laid it out, and they found out that it had exceeded 200 mils to the side, which was a limit back then of silicon. You couldn't make them that big. And as soon as you went over that, it went exponentially higher in cost and such. So they said, start taking stuff out. All right? So the team got together, and they said, if we take this thing that's in the silicon, we take it out, it's okay because we can have the software run a little program that does the same thing that hardware would otherwise do. They did that about a half a dozen times in a half a dozen different places. So what that meant was the software, the hardware sat in grandma's house or in your house and living room, never changed, and it was the software that we changed every time. So the more power you gave to the software, the more versatile the entire system was. So we were making new games, doing new things. I had the designer of the Atari 2600 standing behind me at Atari while I was doing something. I looked back and said, what's up, Jay? And he was just shaking his head. He said, I never imagined my chip could do what you're doing with it right there. So giving the software all the control was the thing that made the Atari 2600 last so long. I'm not sure why I thought of that story because of your question, but your question, there are a number of really fun things. We used to have to reverse engineer, and then finally Nintendo was the first one who said, let's just sign up developers and give them the documentation. And so the reverse engineering kind of stopped at that point.
Well, and the first company in the Western world that was outside Japan that got licensed to work on Nintendo was us. I kept going to Nintendo when they were in 1985 when they were a big success at Christmas, and in 1986 the machine started selling like crazy. But it had been out in Japan for many years, and there were like 1,000 games already for it in Japan. So I went to Nintendo, introduced myself, got a meeting with them, and said, David Crane founded Activision. I'm a successful designer. We want to do games on your platform. And they said, we'd love to have you publish on our platform, but you don't have to make the games because there are 1,000 games in Japan. And I said, no, you got to understand there's cultural differences. Games in Japan aren't all going to work here. There are games that'll work here and not in Japan. They didn't want to hear it. No. So then 6 months later, I go back. 6 months later, I go back. After about 3 trips there, I walked in and they just said, Here's the goddamn document. Sign it. Tired of seeing your face. He said, but the caveat is, all the documentation is for the development equipment is in Japanese, and the development machine costs $35,000 per desk. And I said, all right, would you allow us to make our own development environment for it? We don't care what you do. It's fine. So we signed up. I went home and said, how am I going to make a what? I got this guy I'm going to call. How am I going to make a development system? Call him, Mr. Wizard. So I called Mr. Wizard. I said, we need a Nintendo development system. He created one. We ended up selling it to all the other companies in the video game industry who wanted to get in Nintendo, because nobody wanted a $35,000 brick that was written in Japanese. So
Little known fact that I was a hardware engineer making chips at National Semiconductor before I started writing games in software.
So that's why I knew he could do development systems. So anyway, that's a long way around.
Long way around, but then, so for example, we're working, I think it was the Super Nintendo. And on page 17 in the manual, there's all these different modes. You can have this many colors per pixel. You know, you can arrange the things in all these different ways. There's all these different modes. And there was this little note at the bottom of page 17 that says, don't mix mode 1 and mode 7. What is it, on the same, or at the same time? It said at the same time.
It was actually the Commodore 64.
Was that the C64?
It was the C64.
So
there was this book, this thick.
And it said at the same time.
And on one page, the text was one-point text.
We said, fine. We had a screen that we wanted to do that at the top used one mode and at the bottom used another. It's not being done at the same time, right? So the product is completely finished. We're working on it, and we're getting these bugs that are happening. Completely ridiculous. You know, nobody has any idea what the bug is. Well, it turns out that if you use these two modes on the same frame of video, it turns off the refresh of the dynamic RAM in the system, which means bits start to disappear in RAM.
The way the dynamic RAM works, you put a 29 in a register, and you come back next frame, and you're expecting a 29 to be there. But if it's not being refreshed, you go back there, and now it's 21.
It's an obscure hardware thing that's going on behind the scenes. It's refreshing your dynamic RAM.
No one ever thinks about refreshing, but this was warned in one place in a 500-page book.
So the code was in this RAM, which meant bits were changing from the code, the opcodes in assembly language. And every once in a while, an and would become an or a load would become an or an and. And, you know, we had to find that bug.
It's a miracle we ever found
hooked up logic analyzers and watched the hardware and everything and said, why is that a 29? It's supposed to be A9, you know? And finally solved it. So lots of things like that happened all the time.
Yep. What else? What else we got?
I had a couple questions.
Yes.
Did you work with Jerry Lawson when you were at Semiconductor? Fairchild, I was just curious about that. And then, did you guys? I had like three basically. And then, did you guys work on the extra levels on Pitfall 2 on Atari 800? Because I just was curious. And then the last one was I was wondering if you could talk about the differences between the original games and the ones you're making now, like just in terms of the games or developing them or stuff like that.
Well,
Dave worked at National Semiconductor, not Fairchild.
well, no, but there were, in fact, just at the Computer History Museum 2 weeks ago, I was talking to some of the people that were making the chips for Atari.
Oh,
You know,
okay, I see. Got it.
But had no interaction with them back then. The middle thing, try to make it a quick story, but when I put out Pitfall 2, we decided we wanted Pitfall to be represented on both the Atari 800 and the Commodore 64. And they were being developed by other people. I didn't do the development because I was busy making a new game. And so we put two people in charge of one each, the Atari 800 and the Commodore 64. And they had the game in front of them, so they already knew what the game was supposed to look like. They took the game that I had created as the specification for their work. And one guy created the Commodore 64 version from scratch. He said, I'm going to start from blank sheet of paper and write the first instruction, and I'm going to duplicate your game because I don't like your code. I'm going to write my own code. The other guy said, well, wait a minute, the Atari 800 is a 6502 microprocessor. It's got a lot of similarities to the Atari 2600. And she said, I'm just going to leave everything intact except rewrite the display code to work with the Atari 800 instead of the Atari the Atari 2600, right? And they both finished to beta pretty much at the same time. But the guy who did the Commodore 64 version had started from scratch, and so he had code full of bugs. So it's going to take him a month to debug all that code. Whereas when Mike Lorenzen finished the Atari 800 version of my game, he turned it on and it played. It had my logic for playing it. It had everything was the same and all debugged clean code. So he had to sit there on his hands while the other project went through a month of debugging. Instead of sitting on his hands, he wrote an entirely second adventure level. So when you got to the end of it, a door opened and you went off onto a completely different adventure as big as the original. So we learned, there's two different ways to do it. One is rewrite, which a lot of programmers do because they don't like other people's code, don't understand how they're thinking. And then there's the port, which is now how it's done today, which is all the game logic stays the same. All of the images are in Photoshop. They're all JPEGs or whatever. And all you really have to do is make that game display on a PlayStation instead of an Xbox, and then read the controllers a little differently. So that's how ports are done today. Pretty much following what Mike Lorenzen did for the Atari 800 of Pitfall 2.
So in answer to your third question about how the philosophy of the games, when we decided to do this in 2018, there were chips out, ARM chips, that could go in a cartridge of an Atari and really make it more powerful because they're much faster than the processor in the Atari. And like Champ Games and Atari Age have cartridges with those. And that's great. We don't think there's anything wrong with it. But we didn't want to do that. We wanted to stick with the same crate. Same crate that we had when we were growing up. We didn't want to have a crutch that said, well, now we can do 8 billion colors because we have these 23 chips in the cartridge. So we decided not to do that. One place we had to make an exception was ROMs on the Atari were 2K, 4K, 8K. Well, you can't get any of those anymore. You go to a manufacturer and say, I want an 8K ROM, they laugh you out of the building. Smallest ROM we get is 128K, which is 32 4K banks. And Dave said, the smallest ones I can buy. So we said, well, damn, that means we have 128K to make a game. So that changes the design philosophy because you think a lot about what can I do that's spectacular given all the space I have. So, that's the one major thing. So our games, our Audacity games, are so much deeper than your average Atari game. They're people commenting on Casey's Gold. I put up a trailer on YouTube for it, and the comments are, I cannot believe that all those different game mechanics are in one game. They're just amazed how deep they are because we have the ROM.
So like the moving backgrounds and stuff in Casey's Gold, that would have been impossible before then?
Well, not impossible, but difficult. And the fact that you have running and jumping, but you also have climbing, and you also have riding in a mine cart and jumping out of the mine cart and climbing down into underground caves. These are all things that all together are just a hell of a lot of work. You could have never done it without a bigger ROM.
You could think of it as being 32 to 4K ROMs in a compilation cartridge.
Right.
You're jumping from one to the next, so you can actually have completely separate games.
Go ahead, back there somewhere. Go ahead.
Was it cost or some other reason why Activision didn't use the DPC chip even in their later releases in 86, 87, 2600?
So the DPC chip was what's called the display processor chip, and after Garry just ragged on putting an ARM chip in the cartridge, I did it myself at Activision. DPC are actually my initials,
You
which is how I came up with the acronym in the first place. I went backwards and said, what can I call it that's DPC? It was actually one of the first GPUs ever made, and it was in an Atari cartridge. That was Pitfall 2. So what it did is it just helped. It graphic fetches and things internally to the cartridge that helped feed it to the Atari 2600 in the right order. And it cost money. You know, it was an extra chip, so it made Pitfall 2 was more expensive to make than any of our other 4K or 8K games. And the Atari 2600 was just about to crash. You know, the video game crash was happening. We loved the Atari 2600. It had lived for 10 years. And when I started that design project, I said, I'm going to keep the Atari 2600 alive longer because we love it so much. But financially, it was more expensive to make, and games were now being sold in barrels outside of KB Toys for $5 instead of being sold for $40 back in the back of the store. So the real reason was financial. The market was going away, and it was more expensive to make. I mean, another example, I created a custom bank switching system, which had an awful acronym. It was the Subroutine Controlled Automatic Bank Switcher, which is SCABS as an acronym. And it was the coolest bank switching. It was a completely automatic thing that would happen through the 6502. And it required a 2-cent resistor outside the board on, you know, between two pins on the ROM. And that cost 2 cents more than the other bank switching methods which went inside the cartridge. And so I think Decathlon may have gone out with it and Robot Tank may have gone out with it, but then it got abandoned as well because it cost 2 cents more. So
We wrapping up here? Let me just say that if you go to G10 and 11 on your map, Dave and I are sitting over there. If anybody wants autographs, we're going to be going over and sitting over there after this. And if you are interested in looking at our Audacity games for purchase, we're selling them over there. And